All for being here. You know, I've just been on a book tour, gone to a bunch of cities, done a bunch of talks and readings. This is the first one where there's a table with wine right next to it. I really like that. I need to correct Peter. He said San Francisco Writers Workshop is one of the oldest writers groups in San Francisco. It's actually the oldest in the universe. I can't verify that with documentary evidence, but you said you guys just celebrated your 60th birthday, or are about to? Yeah. And the San Francisco Writers Workshop clocked its 60th birthday 7 years ago, I think it was. So it's really old. Now, seeing how many people are here, I realize I should have prepared something. And you know, the complications of Afghanistan, the politics, the tangle, the fact that people keep invading it, doing the same things, coming to grief, running off, whimpering, then 40 years later coming back, doing it again, either themselves or somebody else. All of that certainly is part of the Afghan story. But tonight I just want to focus in more on the fact that for me, the Afghan history, the Afghan story is just so full of anecdotes and stories that part of the motivation for me in writing this book was to create a frame and then hang all the stories I know on that on that frame. Now, I'm going to search for it, but I'll talk to you as I'm searching for the passage I want to read. In the late 19th century, the last 20 years of the 19th century, the king of Afghanistan, the guy who came to power, was a person who was sort of like a cross between Bismarck and Stalin. And he was an Afghan, you know, he was as brutal as you could imagine, he was as ruthless as you could imagine, and he was as brilliant as you could imagine. I mean, this guy was a colossus. But he was penned up inside Afghanistan. And other times, you know, people like this in that area would go out and conquer India and conquer Iran. He couldn't do that because the British had put up a wall here, the Russians had put up a wall there, and that restless energy turned inwards, and he said, by God, I'm conquering my own country. So 20 years worth of him fighting wars inside Afghanistan and creating an Afghanistan consisting of a bureaucracy that he appointed every member of, and then he laid it over the country like a blanket. And underneath, the old Afghanistan, sort of a soil of elders and clerics just growing up, that was still down there. And so these two Afghanistans were going on. Then he died, and his son came to power. And the thing about him doing what he did is that now Afghanistan was a governable place. It was so, you know, sort of cowed and intimidated that people stayed in their places. And now there was a court and a city and an urban culture, and this next generation that came along, they could turn outward, they could see, now what's going on in the world? Oh gosh, you know, telephones, roads. And people who had fled in various periods started coming back. And these guys had either grown up in or were born and raised in places like Turkey, Egypt, you know, closer to the West and more in contact with the outside world. And let me read about one of these guys. His name was Tarzi. He had been raised in Turkey, and that was the period when the Young Turks were boiling in Turkey. And the Young Turks were these guys who, their basic ideology was enough of the ancient stagnant Muslim past, on into the future. They weren't always young, you know. Some of them started out as young, but they were still young Turks when they were 90. It was an attitude. And so he grew up in the Young Turk environment. He came to Afghanistan. And, you know, our neighbor you know, his father was the king's counselor, and he himself was the foremost 20th century poet of Afghanistan. That's what he grew up to be. But he hung around this guy's house when he was a kid, and his name was Khalilullah. And he wrote a memoir recently, so I read that. He remembered how he was playing around in Tarzi's study one day when he came across several books his teacher had translated from French into Dari, or Farsi. Khalilullah started reading the first one and kept reading until he had inhaled all four. The books were 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, The Mysterious Island, and A Voyage to the Sky, novels by, I'm sure you know, Jules Verne. Tarzi was not just a translator, but a writer. He was an accomplished poet, but he didn't write the old-fashioned stuff that Rumi and Jami and Hafiz and Ansari and other Afghan poets had written. You notice I slipped my own name in there. One of my ancestors was a famous poet. He did use classical forms and follow classical rules of prosody, but his lines were not loaded with images of love and wine, nor of moths incinerating themselves in candles as metaphors for mystical immersion in God. That's what Persian poetry, Afghan poetry really was all about until then. He rhapsodized about telegraph lines and vaccines and streets paved with asphalt. So he started a newspaper. He didn't just write news in it, he wrote that too, but he published articles about, you know, things that were happening in the world, about constitutions, about the French Revolution, about new discoveries in psychology, and he became this charismatic figure in the aristocratic environment of Kabul, and all the young people, or some of the young people, flocked to him. No one drank from the fountain more avidly than the Amir's third son, Prince Amanullah. The Amir is the king, you see. And Prince Amanullah, his third son, just really liked this guy. Tarzi was the father this firebrand never had, so much so that Amanullah married his daughter, the beautiful and accomplished Suraya, which made Tarzi his father-in-law. But Tarzi and his followers were not the only movement bubbling at court. The Amir's brother, Nasrullah, personified a different current. Nasrullah had matured into a zealous Orthodox Muslim. He disdained his brother the king's indolence and concupiscence, but lived with it. When I say concupiscence, you know, what I'm talking about is that the guy had something like, 300 wives or concubines. Maybe there was only 4 that were officially wives, but he just added concubines every time he got a chance. Nasrullah had inherited his father's energy and must sometimes have resented not inheriting the throne, but he lived with it. Nasrullah felt a kinship with all those traditional clerics whom his father had tried to crush or co-opt. Nasrullah knew they were neither crushed nor co-opted, but were still shaping public opinion, still molding the passions of the people out there in the countryside. They were still the ocean. The government and its minions were still just the foam on the waves. Nasrullah had no official job title, but he sometimes acted as though he were king. He once remarked casually to a companion that he might set Habibullah aside one day. Habibullah is the king and his brother. So that's another guy that was around. And among those who came back was a man soon to be known as the Amir's chief counselor, or Musahib, and his 5 sons, the brothers Musahibon. The eldest of these brothers and the leader of the pack was a grim, trim stick figure with gold-rimmed spectacles named Nadir. All 5 sons had grown up in British India and had been educated there in the British system. All 5 were well schooled in courtly graces. All 5 were tough, quiet fellows who hung together and operated as a unit under Nadir's steely direction. Now they were back in Afghanistan. They wormed their way into the king's confidence. Nadir became commander-in-chief of the Amir's armies, while his brothers secured important provincial posts. So, so there you have a cast of characters. There's these 5 steely, quiet, tough brothers. There's the Nasrullah, the king's brother, who is a devoted, zealous conservative Orthodox Muslim, allied to the old Afghanistan out in the countryside. There's Tarzian, Prince Amanullah. He's like this is like the jazz age, and then, you know, these are Hemingway's. Who are the other guys? Gertrude Stein and Hemingway's of Kabul. It was that kind of atmosphere, and these were those guys. The king at this point is a guy named Habibullah. Now, we come now to a mysterious event as riveting as any detective novel. In late February 1919, just after the peace conference began in Paris, this is after World War I, Amir Habibullah went on a grand hunting expedition. February is an odd time for such a trip because the mountains are still choked with snow. But the Amir loved adventure. His Mustawfi stopped in the city of Jalalabad, but the Amir's party went on into the mountains. After the king left, witnesses reported, the Mustawfi, which is his finance minister, his right-hand man, the Mustawfi received a private message that made him pale. Immediately, he wrote a letter to the king and gave it to the messenger, gave it to a messenger. He ordered the messenger to wear black and ride a black horse so as to cut a striking figure that the king would notice. He wanted to make sure the king would read the letter at once. But the king was busy having fun and put the envelope in his pocket unopened. That night, after feasting on grilled meats and subtle side dishes cooked by the royal chefs, the king retired to his tent, happy and spent. His commander-in-chief, Nadir Khan, the eldest of those 5 Mosahiban brothers, was guarding the camp. The king's older brother, Nasrullah, was in camp too. Guards were posted at each of the cardinal points around the tent. A 5th man, a Colonel Raza, stood sentry at his very door. 3 men went into the tent with the king to carry out his bedtime ritual. 2 were masseurs to rub his feet, 1 a storyteller to lull him with fantastic tales. Once the king began to doze, these 3 slipped out of the tent, but they had gone only a few paces when they heard a bang. A dark figure burst from the doorway. Colonel Raza grabbed the mystery man's arm but could not make out his features. At that moment, General Nadir Khan and the king's brother Nasrullah came running up, almost as if they had been hovering nearby, waiting for something to happen. In the confusion, the presumptive killer wrenched loose and went running off, never to be seen again. Some would later say the king's brother and his henchman Nadir helped the assassin escape, for assassin he was. When the men went into the tent, they found the king lying dead, shot through the heart. The assassin must have gotten into the tent earlier and lain in wait. But how could the Amir's security have failed so utterly? Was some high-ranking figure complicit in the crime? The next day, Nasrullah hastened to Jalalabad and declared himself Amir. Jalalabad would be the nearest big city, but not the capital. The king's mild-mannered eldest son stood next to him and pledged his loyalty, giving up the throne just like that. The dead king's second son had left the hunting party a few days earlier, saying he had business in Kabul. Had he gone straight home, he would have been in Kabul when the king was killed, in position for a power play. But he fell ill along the way and stopped in some village to recover. The messenger carrying word of the assassination to the capital must have ridden right past the house where he lay moaning. When the news broke in the capital, therefore, only the 3rd son was on the spot to take advantage. Prince Amanullah, that modernist firebrand. Amanullah wasted no time in seizing the treasury, taking command of the army, and announcing a hefty pay raise to ensure the allegiance of the troops. Then he assembled the city's notables for a passionate speech. Drawing a sword from his scabbard, he swore that, quote, "I will not sheathe it again until I have brought my father's killer to justice." That Friday, when Nasrullah, the dead king's brother, went to the mosque in Jalalabad, he was astonished to hear the sermon read in the name of Amir Amanullah. Moments later, Amanullah's men arrived to arrest him, and charge him with complicity in the Amir's murder. Amanullah then rounded up his father's top advisors, anyone who might pose a threat to him, and put them on trial. The poet Khalilullah, who was a 12-year-old boy then, reports that his father was among those called to court for interrogation by Amanullah. Witnesses saw Amanullah pull out a letter. Presumably, Dewan Mustawfi Hussain had sent the king on the day of his murder. Apparently, in this letter, the Mustawfi had said something incriminating. The new king was demanding that he account for his words. The Mustawfi shouted back for all to hear, "It was you! You killed your own father!" Amanullah ordered that the exchequer be dragged into the garden and hanged. A couple of draftees were brought in to do the deed, simple peasants from the north. As one of them fitted the noose around Mustawfi Hussein's neck, his fingers trembled. The once mighty money man scoffed at him. "I'm the one who's being hung here. Why are your fingers trembling? Do your job, boys. Don't flinch. But when you leave here, tell the world you acted on the orders of Amanullah." A violent end was not uncommon for Afghan rulers, but most were killed in wars or executed after losing wars. The killing of Habibullah was a murder mystery. Who ordered it? Who plotted it? Who carried it out? No one knows. Early armchair detectives suspected Nadir and Nasrullah. Nasrullah had motive, Nadir had opportunity. Perhaps the two were in cahoots. Then again, although Amanullah made a lot of noise about hunting down his father's killers, the only men he actually moved against were those who had pretensions to the throne, not those whom credible evidence implicated in the murder. Very suspicious. Naturally, no one voiced suspicions about Amanullah at the time because he was king. Instead, they confined themselves to muttering dark accusations about Nadir. Later, Amanullah fell from power and Nadir became king. After that, no one voiced suspicions about Nadir anymore. Instead, many now said Amanullah must have plotted the crime. In short, the mystery got intertwined with the political fortunes of the possible suspects, which is why no one knows who done it to this day. But that's getting ahead of our story.